and welcome back to Apologetics. Today I'm joined by Kyle Alander. We're going to be responding to Rationality Rules and his debunking of the argument from consciousness. So, Kyle, how's it going?
It's good. I'm glad to be here and I can address some of his criticisms and we'll get through it.
Yeah, we're going to get into just a very brief moment here. He had a video we put out a few years ago just kind of claiming to debunk the argument from consciousness. So we're going to take a look at it, and it should be a lot of fun. Kyle, do you have any kind of brief thoughts or anything you want to say before we pull this up and get rolling?
I guess just my general thoughts. There's a lot of errors. Although to give him credit, there are some criticisms that I would agree with. Particularly some of the fallacies he points out I think are correct. I'll get more into that later. But generally, I wasn't really impressed by the video, and I'll get into why. And I'll also go over other arguments from consciousness that sort of avoid his objections. But yeah, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks great. What we'll do now is we'll pull up the video, and we'll get this thing going. And in case you didn't know, Kyle has the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. He's an idealist, so he's definitely going to say the argument from consciousness works. So let's get going.
Likewise to most theological arguments, there are many types of arguments from consciousness, each differing in the premises they use and the way they're conveyed. But in this video, we're going to focus on the most popular type, that being arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can. So, to present this argument in its syllogistic form, it is a fact that human consciousness exists. This fact can be adequately explained within a theistic framework, i.e., one which posits God's existence, whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a naturalistic or materialistic framework, i.e., one which lacks a belief in God's existence. Hence, there is a fact that only theism can adequately explain. Therefore, God exists. To take on this argument,
what are your thoughts on his presentation of the argument, Kyle?
So I thought it was okay. I mean, I wouldn't use that sort of argument. I would probably use just an inference of best explanation approach. So yeah, I would probably disagree with. I wouldn't say theism is the only theory that can explain consciousness. I would just say that it's the best theory that can explain consciousness. So that's the only real distinction I would make there. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really a fan of deductive arguments. I think that ultimately all deductions are going to reduce to inductions. So I'm going to use, if I were to use the argument, I would probably just say the best explanation is that theism explains it better than, because I do think that there are alternative explanations. I just think that they're not as good. Right. So that's what I would say.
Where did he get this argument? Is it J.P. Moreland in the Blackwell Companion? Is that who made the argument he presents?
So I have the argument written down, although I don't agree with his version of the argument. I guess I'll just quickly go over it. So premise 1, mental events are genuine, non-physical mental entities that exist. Premise 2, specific mental entities and physical event types are regularly correlated. Therefore, there is an explanation for these correlations. Personal explanation is different from natural scientific explanation. Premise 5, the explanation for these correlations is either personal or a natural scientific explanation. Premise 6, the explanation is not a natural scientific one. Therefore, the explanation is a personal one. And of course, if the explanation is a personal one, then it is theistic. Therefore, the explanation is theistic. Now, I just want to emphasize, I do not agree with J.P. Moreland's version of that argument, specifically because that's the one he uses in the Blackwell Companion. So I don't agree with that argument, but I do agree with the overall, I guess, way of thinking about it, right? Where you basically have theism as a theory to explain consciousness, right? Given that God is a conscious being, right? You only have to explain you have to explain consciousness in terms of consciousness. So if God is conscious, then, it seems like, he would create conscious creatures, right? So that's what I would say. Now, again, I don't like J.P. Moreland's version of the argument for various reasons. I'm not going to get into those here, but the point is, I agree with the framework that he's using, which is basically, theism explains consciousness better than the alternatives, right? So that's what I would say.
Yeah. I think that's great. See what else he has to say here.
Argument, it's critical that we first define what consciousness means. and preferably within 10 hours. But jokes aside, its basic definition is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, which is indeed what most of us mean when we say consciousness.
Okay, stop
but
it.
The reason this needs to be nailed.
Okay, so the problem is, and he sort of gets into this a little bit after this, but so this definition is not actually correct within the philosophy of mind. This is typically, well, to be fair though, I mean, this is the definition of consciousness that scientists use, right? Because that's how scientists describe consciousness. But when we're actually talking about like consciousness as defined within the philosophy of mind, right? This is not the definition that they're going to use, right? Because I think when you get into like different fields, like a psychologist is going to have a different definition than a neurologist, and then of course a philosopher of mind is going to have a different definition as well. So the one I'm concerned with is the philosophy of mind definition, right? And this is not that, right? So that's the first big error I just want to point out, and then you can sort of continue on the video, and I'll sort of explain more about why that's the case. But yeah, go ahead.
Nailed down immediately is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not, such as a transcendent part of the human personality. And in doing this, they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness, which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question.
Okay, stop it. Okay, yeah, so that's a big error. I don't really, I mean, at least within the philosophy of mind, I mean, yeah, you might have some people that'll define consciousness that way, but typically there's a agreed upon definition, right? So this is the one I'm going to get into. So basically, consciousness is mental activity in and of itself. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there is anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. Another definition we could put forth would be this. Mental activity is conscious if there is something it feels like to have such mental activity in and of itself. The words to feel, however, is not clear enough to be used as a definition, so philosophers of mind typically define consciousness as anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. So that's the definition, right? Just mental activity in and of itself. Now, notice I don't include non-physical properties into that definition, right? Because it's completely neutral on whether or not consciousness is reducible or irreducible or material or immaterial. So for me, I say that consciousness is just irreducible, right? And that's different than saying that it's immaterial, right? Because I don't even know what, I don't even like the word immaterial. I don't even use that word in my language, right? Some people might, but I certainly don't. So when I talk about consciousness, I just say that it's irreducible, right? So you can't explain it in terms of things that are not conscious, right? So when you're talking about consciousness, that's the base, right? You can't really explain it in terms of anything else, right? So when we're talking about consciousness, we're just saying that that something is conscious, it's irreducible, and that's it, right? It doesn't have to include these extra properties, as he wants to, call it. And I think another thing, I'll get into this more later, but he gets a really like poor explanation of consciousness, and he doesn't really do a good job of like going over the alternative views of consciousness within the philosophy of mind. Even like views within physicalism, because there are various views even within the physicalist camp. So even he doesn't even do a good job of like going over consciousness within his own, like within the view that he would agree with, right? So that's another issue, but yeah.
Yeah, no, the only thing I was curious about, like he talks about consciousness being like the theistic definition of it is just being like supernatural, or he says unnatural. And like that's one of those things where like the supernatural and natural distinction is like kind of weird, because it's almost like it seems like if we're gonna grant like a theistic definition of consciousness, then would you say that consciousness is then supernatural? And like would that imply that maybe like, I don't know, the consciousness isn't even real if you want to say like only the natural exists? Well, I don't know. It just seems weird, like saying that like a theistic definition of consciousness is unnatural.
Because I would agree with him if he's going to say that consciousness is natural. I would totally agree with him on that, right? Because I don't like the definition of, I don't like that distinction between the natural and supernatural. I think it's meaningless, right? So I think when we're talking about consciousness, I think it's better to talk about it in terms of it being reducible or not, right? And even if you're a naturalist, I just want to emphasize, and I'll get more to this later, but even if you're a naturalist, you can say that consciousness is irreducible, right? You don't have to be a reductionist to consciousness in order to say that it's, irreducible or something. So you could actually, in a way, you could actually agree with the theistic definition. If a theistic definition just says that consciousness is irreducible, well, you could just accept that and just have a natural theory, right, that explains consciousness in terms of it being irreducible. Again, I'll get more into that later, but that's another thing I want to sort of emphasize here.
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
So yeah,
let's do it.
Hence, however one defines consciousness, they must first acknowledge that every shred of evidence has so far supported the statement that consciousness is a product of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that our consciousness is independent of our bodies. No.
Okay. Yeah, that's another.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's wrong. I mean, it depends on what you mean by evidence, right? There may not be great evidence, right? But there's certainly evidence, right? I mean, there's near-death experiences. There's psychedelic drugs that people take that will decrease your brain activity, but then increase your conscious experiences. I mean, it may not be great evidence, right? But it's still evidence, right? So I think it needs. If he's going to say that there's absolutely no good evidence, well, maybe, right? But if you're saying there's no evidence at all, well, that seems kind of weird. I mean, there is evidence, right? Just like I would say that there's evidence for naturalism, right? Even though I'm not a naturalist, there is evidence for naturalism, right? I'm not going to say there's absolutely no evidence for naturalism, right? There's always going to be some evidence for naturalism because all that evidence requires, the definition of evidence is that which makes a hypothesis more likely, right? So near-death experiences would be evidence. Psychedelic drugs would be evidence, right? It may not be great evidence, but it's still evidence. So that's another issue I want to point out here. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because sometimes I feel like in a lot of more popular level atheist videos, they want to have this very restrictive view of what counts as evidence.
Right.
It seems to go against the idea of free thinking and critical thinking and following the evidence wherever it leads. When we put evidence into this little box of only this counts as what would be evidence. Yeah,
another thing I want to point out here is to suggest our consciousness is independent of our bodies. I'm not really sure what he means by that. I mean, because as an idealist like myself, I would say that it's the mind. Sorry, not the mind. It's the body that's in the mind, not the other way around. So I wouldn't say that there's this immaterial mental stuff that floats in my head, and then when I die, it just leaves. No, it's not. It's not how it works, right? Because the body itself is part of the mental environment. So if everything's mental, right, then even my body would itself be part of that mental environment. So this whole idea, so consciousness cannot be independent of our bodies. There's nothing independent from consciousness. So I would just reject the whole distinction between the body and consciousness because on my view of idealism, there is no distinction between those, right? They're all part of one system. They're all, one ontology, right? So that's another thing I want to point out, but yeah.
Yeah, that's good. All right, let's keep going.
Get on with it. Let's debunk the argument from consciousness. In my opinion, the first objection to be stated is that premise 3 doesn't follow from premise 2, making the entire argument a non-sequitur. Even if we were to assume that theism can adequately explain consciousness and that naturalism can't, it by no means follows from this alone that only theism can explain consciousness. To name a few alternatives, deism and pantheism can both explain consciousness within their frameworks, and so right from the outset, the argument from consciousness isn't coherent.
Okay.
Its conclusion doesn't follow.
You can stop it. Yeah, so this is an interesting point. I would probably agree with him on this point at least. Now, I'm not sure about pantheism. That seems kind of, I don't know about that. That one's kind of weird. But I would certainly agree that deism can explain consciousness. Another theory that I think could explain it, although not as good, is probably non-reductive physicalism, right? There's some models that I think are pretty interesting, although I don't find them convincing. Another theory is panpsychism, right? So if Emerson Green is watching this, I would agree that panpsychism is another naturalistic theory that I think could explain consciousness, as well as cosmopsychism, like the one from Philip Goff. So yes, I would agree that there are alternative explanations, right? Now, the question is whether or not they're the best ones. Obviously, I think that theism is still the best one, but the point I'm trying to make here is there are going to be alternative explanations. So I guess I would sort of agree, at least with this criticism of the argument that he's presenting. Right now, of course, if I'm going to use an argument from consciousness, I'm not going to use the one that he's presenting. I'm going to use, an abductive one, right? So that's what I would say. But
yeah. No, I agree with you, and I think that it's a fair criticism because it doesn't just support theism. It would, consciousness can support cosmopsychism or panpsychism or something like that. And that's the problem. When you get into well, it's the argument from consciousness. Well, it's not. It's just one of many. So
right. Yeah.
All right. If I can ever load the video again, we'll keep going. There we go.
Follow from its premises, even if they were all valid, which, so far as arguments go, is pretty damn pathetic. But while we're on the topic of alternative worldviews that can explain consciousness, the fact that the argument from consciousness posits only naturalism and theism as valid options, without justifying why these two options are the only available, means that it commits a black and white fallacy. Furthermore, and by extension, this also means that the argument hasn't fulfilled its burden of proof. It hasn't substantiated the claim that only naturalism and theism are valid options. A third flaw to...
Do you have anything? Because I thought it's not... One of the things that I didn't really understand about that, little bit, is it's okay, so it's only naturalism or theism, and this is going to get into a little bit of the definition of atheism. But if we define theism as the belief that a God or God exists, and atheism is a belief that a God or God doesn't exist, then that's the only two options. The law of law in the middle. So
that is a good point, because it really depends. Again, it depends on what you mean by naturalism, right? So if you define naturalism that precludes theism, right, then that could include panpsychism. That could include some of the options I just mentioned earlier, right? So that can sort of be an umbrella term for these different non-theistic explanations, right? Or all these, I guess, these theories that explanations that preclude theism, right? So if you're going to include that, well, then those are the only two options, right? Either naturalism, where it precludes theism, or theism that precludes naturalism, right? But if you define naturalism in terms that doesn't conflict with theism, well, then I could just argue from a sort of supreme naturalism, right? Like what Josh Rasmussen does and a few others. So it really depends on what you mean by naturalism, because if you define naturalism as the exclusion of theism, well, those are the only two options, right? It's not a false dichotomy in that case, right? Because you've explicitly defined naturalism as that which precludes theism. Now, if he's defining naturalism in terms of physicalism, right? Then yeah, it is a false dichotomy, because there are non-theistic views that are not physicalistic, right? Panpsychism is one example. Cosmopsychism is another example. But my point still stands, right? If you define naturalism as that which precludes theism, then that's going to include all the other views, like panpsychism and cosmopsychism. So that's what I would say.
It's at least for me, I don't want to get into it too much right now because it's not about the argument from consciousness, but the whole supernatural natural distinction really, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And being naturalism is the opposite of theism. Well, if you're going to be a cosmopsychist or a panpsychist or something, often I just wonder how much different is that than theism. In terms of just theism doesn't count as naturalism, but these theories of the mind can. But maybe that's for a little bit later.
Right. Okay.
To raise is that even if the conclusion of the argument was valid, all it would prove is that theism alone can explain consciousness. It wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a specific religion is true. And as Christopher Hitchens once said, even if you've established deism, you've still got all of your work ahead of you to be a theist. Hence, even if it was valid.
Yeah, this is kind of one of those objections where it's because it doesn't even relate to the argument from consciousness.
Yeah, because that's not the point of the argument. But whatever. I'm not even going to respond to that because there's no point. So
I feel there's been so many people that have responded to this. Well, doesn't support your specific God objection. That at this point, we really don't need to. Because I feel most people realize by now that this is just a very bad objection to any argument from natural theology, except an argument from religious experience. This is actually a decent objection against that.
Yeah,
valid. The argument from consciousness doesn't remotely support a specific theistic religion. A fourth spectacular flaw that the argument from consciousness commits is a giant argument from ignorance. If we cut to the core of what's being asserted, it's essentially that because we can't explain consciousness from a naturalistic framework, which, by the way, we can, theism must be correct. Or put more directly, the argument from consciousness is founded on the statement that we don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God.
Well, yeah.
A
So
fifth law.
okay, so you can start it. So yeah, that is now the way that he put it. That is an argument from ignorance, but that's not what the actual argument says, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if the argument was we can't explain consciousness on naturalism, therefore theism, well then yeah, that is an argument from ignorance, but that's not the argument, right? So it doesn't apply. So his objection doesn't apply to the actual argument from consciousness or arguments from consciousness. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting because, like, literally, like, that's not, like, in the argument that, like, he presented from, I think it's J.P. Moreland. Like, this is not what the argument says. It doesn't say, well, we don't know how to explain it to God. It says if genuine mental states exist, they can't be explained by a materialistic or materialistic universe. Therefore, it's a personal explanation. So it's like, well, there must be a personal explanation for consciousness. So it's just like, I don't know. It's just, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing, because I just thought of it, is I feel like a lot of times people confuse science for materialism. Like, I'm assuming that, like, Stephen thinks there's a materialistic explanation for consciousness, which is different, I think, than saying that it's a scientific explanation.
That is a good distinction to make, because when it comes to, like, scientific explanations, I think that science is ontologically neutral about the nature of reality. So the scientific explanation is not going to tell you what matter actually is. Right. So it's not going to really tell you, like, which view of the philosophy of mind you should take. So
and, like, even, like, the theory of evolution, like, it's a theory. Like, we use
into that
processes to develop it. But, like,
I will get into that when he talks about that. But
all right.
God. A fifth flaw, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection. At the risk of boring you through repetition, natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings, and consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings.
Okay.
And finally,
you can stop it. Okay, so there's a big. Okay, this is where, like, he completely, like, messes up. So natural selection does not tell you. Okay, like I said earlier, I mean, I mentioned the first point about how science doesn't actually tell you the ontological nature of matter, right? So that's the first error. The second error is probably more serious. So this is a quote from David Chalmers. So the process of natural selection cannot distinguish between me and my zombie twin. Evolution selects properties according to their functional role, and my zombie twin performs all of the functions that I perform just as well as I do. In particular, he leaves around just as many copies of his genes. It follows that the evolution alone cannot explain why conscious creatures rather than zombies evolved. The real problem with consciousness is to explain the principles of virtue which consciousness arises from physical systems. Presumably, these principles, whether they are conceptual truths, metaphysical necessities, or natural laws, are constant over space-time. If a physical replica of me had popped into existence 1 billion years ago, it would have been just as conscious as I am. The connecting principles themselves are therefore independent of the evolutionary process. While evolution can be very useful in explaining why particular physical systems have evolved, it is irrelevant to the explanation of the bridging principles of virtue of which some of these systems are conscious. So that's from David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind. So I just want to point out here that given our definition of consciousness, so given that consciousness is mental activity in and of itself, that's not going to tell you how mental activity in and of itself came from something that is not itself mental activity in and of itself, right? Like, for example, a panpsychist, they could just say, well, consciousness is irreducible. It's always been there, right? And let's say that you're a sort of like, let's say if you're a bottom-up panpsychist, right? Well, you could say, well, everything in the universe is conscious in some sense, and then you get creatures that can have like this metacognitive awareness of their own consciousness, and that's an important distinction I want to make here. So that's the third criticism, is that he doesn't really understand the distinction between consciousness and metacognition, right? So I guess I should sort of clarify what those two terms mean. So metacognition is the ability to know about one's experiences, right? It is the ability to think about one's own thinking. But experience, right, is not identical to metacognition. You could have experiences even if you're not like self-aware of those experiences, right? As an example, you're breathing right now, right? Now you're metacognitively aware of your breathing, but it's not like you didn't have experience of breathing, right? Just because you're not metacognitively aware of it. And this is related to the two main systems in the brain that are related to awareness. And I'm going to actually get into this in my next video, but basically the idea is that the brain has many functions, but the two important ones for metacognition involve the default mode network and the dorsal attention network. So the default mode network is responsible for introspection as well as being aware of our own experiences, like our own inner thoughts and stuff. And then the dorsal attention network is responsible for us being aware of our external environments. And so what these two systems, what they explain is our knowledge of consciousness. It's our knowledge of experience, or what I term self-reflexive consciousness. But we are able to gain knowledge of our experiences through these processes, but it doesn't actually explain why we even have those experiences in the first place. Because the question is, why do we have these experiences, right? That's not something that you're not going to be able to answer from a pure neurobiological perspective, right? Because any brains, like if you say there's this one brain system or systems of brain systems that explain consciousness, well, then we need to ask, why are those brain systems conscious? What's the relevant difference between that system and anything else in the universe? You're not going to be able to give an answer to that question, right? So that's another, I guess, big error I want to point out here is, yes, evolution can explain our awareness of experience, right? But it's not going to be able to explain the experience itself, right? It's not going to be able to give you a physicalist model of how experience emerges or something like that, right? So but what I'm basically saying is evolution is totally consistent with the idea that consciousness is irreducible, that consciousness is the base of reality. So if you're an idealist like myself, what you could say, and this is sort of my view, this is also Bernardo Kastrup's view, that you have this one universal mind, and then through the process of dissociation, you have these conscious creatures, and through evolution and natural selection, then they're able to, gain knowledge of their own experiences. They're able to have metacognitive awareness of their own experiences. If you're a panpsychist or cosmopsychist, you can sort of give a similar answer where consciousness is just irreducible. It's the ground, not the ground, but like all matter has consciousness, right? And then through the evolutionary process, then the consciousness can then know about its own experiences, right? So that's how evolution plays the role. So evolution explains how we know consciousness, how we know experience. But what it does not explain, it's not going to tell you why there's experience in the first place, right? That's a totally separate thing, right? And that's why David Chalmers, that's why he points out, like, evolution by natural selection is not going to be able to distinguish between a conscious creature and a zombie, because they're only talking about the functional, roles, right? They're not actually talking about the consciousness itself, right? So I just want to point that out to, the audience, right? That I do think that evolution can explain how we gain knowledge of our consciousness, but it's not going to be able to explain consciousness itself, right? So
I think that's good. And like the Chalmers quote that you gave in the beginning, where Chalmers talks about, well, couldn't have I just have evolved as like a philosophical zombie that can do all the things that like eat, sleep, drink, reproduce, can do all those things, but then isn't conscious. Like it seems like obviously yes. It seems like Chalmers does a good job. They're talking about how like consciousness isn't necessary. Like it's not a part of like you say like we have a mouth to eat. It doesn't seem like the same kind of like necessary thing as part of like our evolutionary history for us to. Like,
I think that's the probably the biggest error in or this is his Rationality Rules is explanation of consciousness. It's like I can grant like all these points right here. I can grant that the nervous system evolved the orchestrated movement. I can say that awareness gave us the ability, but that's not going to tell you why consciousness evolved. Like that last part about consciousness evolved. Well, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, I agree that consciousness can change, right? Like you could sort of mold consciousness, and I think that's basically my view, where I think that consciousness is irreducible, but then evolution sort of allowed us to, know about our own consciousness, essentially. But consciousness itself is still why there is consciousness in the first place. That's not something that evolution is going to be able to tell you, right? And so that's the issue that I see.
It's like something else I was just thinking about is like one of the things with consciousness is like you can't divide your experience in half. Like I can't divide your consciousness in half, Kyle.
Yeah.
So, but then like with like evolution, like, well, you can say like there's an evolutionary explanation for like why do things just grow taller, or something like that. But like it's just not the same thing. Like he's confusing categories. But John debunked us by saying consciousness is just the brain. So
yeah. Okay.
I guess we need to go home and cry about how we suck. Okay, ready for the next bit?
Yep. Go ahead.
To allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings. And finally, a fifth flaw that many of the proponents of the argument from consciousness commit is a personal incredulity fallacy. While I implied earlier that all of the proponents of this argument commit an argument from ignorance fallacy, that's not always true. Some proponents will appeal to ignorance and will indeed commit an argument from ignorance, but others won't appeal to ignorance and will instead simply dismiss evolution by natural selection because they can't personally understand it, and hence they'd be committing a personal incredulity fallacy. So, to recap, the argument from
okay, there we go. That's kind of like I think that's very unfair. Because like I know this video was made like 4 years ago, but like take for example like inspiring philosophy. Like we may disagree with like his quantum idealism or whatnot. It's actually be on my channel tomorrow, so that'll be fun. But like you may disagree with him, but like he's combed through so many like science studies. Like you can see that like in his videos and such, and like he's not just like closing his eyes and like having this personal incredulity. Like I don't know how much Stephen has actually spent. I've spent nothing reading neuroscience, and I don't know how much Stephen has, but I'm sure it's not nearly as much as like IP. And it's just kind of unfair to just say, well, they're saying it's difficult to understand, so they're going to stamp God on it. Like it's just unfair and uncharitable.
Yeah, and I'll get more. Actually, I'll tell you off stream about what I'm gonna do related to the explanatory power of theism. But yeah, I mean, I do agree that I don't think it's some people might, like the creationists might, say, oh, well, evolution is just false, right? So that's not really an explanation. But of course, I'm a theistic evolutionist, so I'm not going to go that route. But yeah. Yeah.
I think this is like the end of the video because he just gives him like a shout out to Hemet Meta for giving him a shout out. So is there anything else you want to cover in this video before we start to wrap things up here?
No, I think it's pretty good. I mean, we went over everything. So of course, the first problem I would point out earlier is he gets the definition of consciousness wrong. So I had to sort of clarify. Another thing is he doesn't really make a distinction between self-reflexive consciousness and consciousness proper, right? The distinction between consciousness and a metacognition. And then another thing, another error was, I think, the false dichotomy. Well, I could probably agree with him on that there are definitely alternative explanations other than theism and naturalism, depending on what you mean by those. So yeah, that's all I got to say. And of course, the argument from it's not meant to address a specific religion. We've already gone over that. And of course, the argument from consciousness is not an argument from ignorance. So yeah, that's all I got to say in response to that. Hopefully, I did see that he didn't take it down, but he made it unlisted, his Kalam video, his older one. So hopefully, I'm really hoping, I don't know, but like, I'm hoping that like he takes down his older videos, like this one, for example, and he sort of revises them or something, right? Because some of his older content is definitely not good, right? And I'm hoping that he can learn like through the experience, and hopefully he'll be able to like take down those videos and like, I don't know, redo them or something, because I think a better criticism of the argument of consciousness would just to point out like there's that there's all these different theories, like, you know, I mentioned panpsychism, cosmopsychism, right? So I think if he did a video like that, I think I would be more sympathetic to his criticism. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair. Like, I think about like all my, like, I have a lot of old videos up on my channel still. Like, if you like looked at them, you can make me look really dumb. Like I said, like there was a point like maybe like 3 years ago where I was like, whatever exists as a cause, duh. The universe began to exist, duh. The universe as a cause is in space, time, and matter began to exist. Space is timeless, immaterial. Like, we're done. Like, the Kalam is just like 100% rock solid. And like, I'm not saying the Kalam doesn't work, but it's just like my views have changed over time, and like old videos don't represent like present views. I wouldn't be surprised with Steven, because this is from like I think 2018 or 2017. So I'm sure his views have changed a lot since then. But I mean, if it's up, as long as we're charitable, I think it's totally fair to respond to it. Because like, if someone wanted to go through some of my old videos and respond, it may not represent me now, but they're still up there. So I think that's fair. So
yeah.
Okay, well, Kyle, it's been a lot of fun. Any last words before we wrap up here?
Nope. I guess my last point is hopefully Steven like takes down this video and like redoes it or something. And I think that it's important that both sides sort of improve upon their content, right? So the atheists, it's like someone like Steven, I would recommend he read people like Graham Oppie, people like Paul Draper, J.H. Sobel, like the actual atheist philosophers that really like go hard on natural theology, because I think they have pretty good objections, right, to these sort of arguments. Not just the argument from conscience, but like any sort of argument for God. So I encourage that all atheists read the actual atheist philosophers, and then the theists, they read people like, you know, Richard Swinburne, Josh Rasmussen. So yeah, I hopefully both sides can sort of improve upon their arguments. And I think if we do that as a community, as an online community on both sides, then that's going to increase the dialectic. So
yeah, it's just about seeking truth, exchanging ideas, working together, seeking truth, at least how I see it. But Kyle, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun. In the YouTube description, I was able to tag Kyle, so you can literally just click on the description and go to Christian Idealism and check out the channel, all things idealism, and you can check it out over there. And if you're new to our channel, I always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like. If you like response videos like this, there is a playlist with all the responses that we've done right below in the description. It's one of the first things you'll see, so you can check that out. And if you enjoyed this channel, you can subscribe, leave a like. I already said all that. But what I didn't say is you can support us on patreon.com/Apologetics for as little as $1 a month. We're very close to our full funding. And like, if everyone that listens to like our videos regularly gave like $1 a month, we'd be fully funded. So if you want to do that, your support's always appreciated. But Kyle, it's been real. Thank you for your time. Yep. Thank you everyone for tuning in, exploring reality. That one gamer, web slinger, JMD Apologetics. Have a good one. God bless.